Welcome to part two. Okay, you don't have to watch the first video I posted, but I posted this in two videos because I found something in Exodus to talk about, but there's a whole setup. I don't want to just break through in the middle of the story, which is what I'm going to do here. So, if you want to know the context, we're talking in Exodus 3, 4, like when Moses is called. If you want more context, you can either open your Bible and just read it yourself, or I put another video up. I put this video up in two pieces. So, whatever you want to do, that's up to you. But we're going to dive in now. So, here's what I found, right? I'm like, it only took 10 minutes to set it up. But here's what I found as I'm in Exodus that is so relevant. So, in Exodus, like we were talking about, Moses, or if you've read the Bible yourself, if you haven't watched the first video, that's fine. So, when Moses is called, God starts to call him in chapter 3, in verse 7. God starts talking to Moses. He's brought Moses to a burning bush. That's how he got his attention. And then he's like, hey, it's me, God. You're on holy ground. Take your shoes off and let's have a conversation. And he starts to talk to Moses and he says, Moses, I'm sending you into Egypt because I see it. I see the injustice. I see my people. I hear them, and I'm sending you. And Moses also had this unique life that God had written where Moses and only Moses, there's nobody else that this happened to. Moses was saved and pretty much like adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, and Pharaoh and the leaders of Egypt were trying to kill God's people. Moses was born in God's people and he was one of God's people. And he was brought in and raised in Pharaoh's household. That's such a big deal, and that's something that only his story was written that way. And so now God comes back around to that, and well, yeah, we'll just say that God. I mean, like Moses is old, okay? So, in the moments that Moses was growing up in that space, he didn't necessarily know that God was writing a story. But God has now come to him, and Moses is older. He doesn't live in Egypt. He's made his own life for himself. He's married, he has kids, and he was out doing normal day to day life when he sees this random burning bush. And God's like, actually, there is a purpose in how I wrote your story. And he starts calling Moses, and um, four times Moses has a protest to God or pleading with God to not use him. And every time God answers him, he's like, you have that worry, this, you have that question, this. And then finally, there's this fifth time where Moses in Exodus 4, chapter 4, verse 13, Moses goes, please send anyone but me. And that's the first time God has had this whole conversation with him, because God's goal with us, he wants relationship with us. So God has no problem going back and forth with Moses and being like, oh, you're not sure how that would work out? Here's some miracles so they believe you. Oh, you need a name for me for when they ask you who sent you. Here's my name. I will give you the gift of my name to talk to my people with. And there's all these things. And then after all that, the only time that God gets mad, and scripture says in Exodus 4:14, it says, then the Lord was angry with Moses. And he said that after Moses said, send anyone but me. So that's a whole other conversation on when you're called and when you say no. And we have all these excuses. And the thing is, like, God is okay with the fear. He's okay with us not understanding. He's okay, and he's willing to have the conversation. But it's a different thing when we say, just send someone else. There's a big difference between I don't understand, I'm scared, I don't know how, and don't use me. And here is what's crazy that stuck out to me. I mentioned this, and you can read this on your own too in chapter 3 of Exodus, but when God starts the conversation with Moses, he says it in chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. It says, then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, which, like, I just even love this little mini introduction to Moses being called, because there's so many questions on why there's evil in the world. There's lots of questions about God in general. And when God does come in and say something about injustice, it's like, I have certainly seen it. This isn't going unnoticed. I'm not working I'm not inactive. I'm not passive about this. There's a timeline that I'm following. There's a plan. You're not always going to understand what I'm doing, but what you can understand is that I am doing something. Because he cares about his people. Then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers, because the people of God were in Egypt and the Egyptians had enslaved the people of God. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians have abused them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people of Israel out of Egypt. I'm like ready to get emotional just over reading that. Here's what's crazy. We know that was the introduction to the conversation where Moses is like, who am I to do this? And God's like, I'm going with you. Well, what do I say when they ask who sent me? You can say that I am sent you, and here's promises. Well, what if they don't believe me? Here's miracles. Well, what about my speech? I created your mouth. And then it all ends, even in all that, Moses is like, send anyone else. Here's what's crazy. Moses, years before, like my Bible is a study Bible, and it suggests 40 years before. It suggests that Moses was about 40 years old when he left Egypt, and then 80 years old when God came to him in the burning bush. I would want to do more research before I just throw those numbers out, but there's some context. But 40 years before, Moses was having this, like, he knew that he was an Israelite. He knew that he was a person of God, but that he had been raised in Pharaoh's home and with the Egyptians. And he saw an Egyptian abusing and being harsh with a slave, and he had this boiling injustice and emotional response to that injustice, and he killed the Egyptian that was mistreating the slave. And and then he ended up fleeing Egypt and going out to where he is now, where God finds him. And then that very injustice, that is what God is inviting him in to solve and to go be a part of, and to go be part of the solution of. And Moses is like, send anyone else. Anyone. And I'm sure there's a little bit of the like, no, I killed a guy, I don't want to do that. But there's so much more than just that. Is it because he'd gotten comfortable? Now he has a wife and a family and kids and like a day job. Is that why? Is it because he has the established home and he's comfortable? Is it because the distance, he doesn't see it happening right in front of him? And so therefore it's like the things on the other side of the world. It's like, yeah, I know my clothes are made in this sweatshop, but like they're on the other side of the world, and like I get really, it sucks, I'm sure, but I'm far. Is it the distance, or is it just a human nature? The thing is, we are made in God's image, and he makes us in this way that reacts to injustice and is not okay with it. But Moses is so me, and maybe you. I'm going to talk about how Moses is like me, and just this connection and what it pointed out. So Moses, when he left Egypt, he killed somebody out of this injustice and out of this, like, this isn't okay. Somebody has to do something. And I really, really debated using this example, but it's relevant and I'm going to. There are so many very, very real injustices that we get so upset about, and we get loud on social media, and we get loud in debates in the workplace or with friends or whatever. And I'm not saying we shouldn't get loud, but here's what happens. We have our Moses moments. I have my Moses moments. And I get really loud, or I get really passionate, and I get really on fire. And I'm like, somebody has to do something. And I can even, like, for a good reason, I can be like, this isn't okay. Somebody needs justice. And I go out and I do something about it in my passion, in the overflow of what I feel about this injustice. which is what Moses said. Honestly, all of us would even kind of agree with what Moses said. We don't, murder's wrong. But I can tell you there's been multiple times where I'm like, oh yeah, Moses killed a guy. Yeah, I forgot about that. In those inspirational things where it's like, God used a liar, a fisherman, and and it talks about like who God is able to use. It's like, God used a murderer. And I'm like, what murderer did God use? And I'm like, oh, yeah, Moses only played a giant role in the whole biblical narrative. And I always forget that he was a murderer. And it's because we're like, well, you murdered him for a good reason. Not okay to murder, but you murdered him for a good reason. And that's like so many of the ways that I can react to an injustice or frustration or something where I'm like, this is not okay. Even when I do it wrong, it's like, well, like, even if that was the wrong response or not that helpful of a response, like, it's even justified because it's like, no, it isn't okay. So, like, there are laws going up right now that have to do with abortion and what's legal and not legal. And I 100% understand an outrage and being loud and posting articles and talking about it all the time. But I know I have these moments with a justice issue where I have my big Moses moment and it's emotional and it's not, and nobody would even say that I'm wrong. And like, hey, like I'm posting this article, like I'm gonna be vocal, we're gonna talk about it. Nobody would even say I'm wrong. And I wouldn't even necessarily say I'm wrong for talking about it. But here's the thing, it doesn't fix the injustice, it doesn't solve it, it doesn't redeem the situation. And then God comes in and he says, Stephanie, I've seen and I've heard and I'm not okay with it. And I've made you in a way where I want to use you in this. And he's like, I've put you in a space where I would like to ask you to give to the crisis centers where women go. There are, those stats on women who have had abortions is crazy on how many women just didn't know what their other options were or they didn't feel supported at all. And that changed so much of what they did when they had a giant decision to make. And there are these pregnancy crisis centers that are there as but they need some, like they need a way to exist, like they need donors. And I have excuses for God, and I'm like, yeah, see, like here's the thing, like I care about it, but like that's a big commitment, like that's like I don't have money, I myself, and I live off of support, like I don't have money. Okay, God's like, okay, what about volunteering your time to it then? Because somebody has to. I'm like, at a crisis center, I don't know if that's, do I even have the skills for that? And he was like, yeah, I made you with the skills for that. Or break it away. He has so many ways where we can get involved. Do you know the stats on the poor girls who get stuck in the foster care system, which is by no fault of their own? They're in foster care. No kid is in foster care because of a decision that they made. But the girls that are in foster care and the stats on what can happen in their lives as far as addiction or being the person that would walk into a clinic one day are crazy. So like, what about opening your home to foster care, or even just opening your life to have time, to pouring into people and giving them your time and being a resource for them and being a relationship for them and being a mentor for them? Or the guys, like who's going to step up and help boys see what it is to be a man? And like who's going to mentor them and give their time over? And we have, and God's like, and here's the thing, when we look at that and we're like, Moses killing a guy didn't overthrow slavery, but God had this giant and intricate and powerful and like this, like you can't get away from the Lord of Heaven's armies. Literal seas were split and plagues came, and there was all these things where he's softening hearts and hardening hearts, and all of those things happen, and God's like, I have a narrative for this injustice and you have a response to this injustice. And like clearly there's something in you that knows this isn't okay. Come with me, let me bring you into the narrative to be a part of changing the narrative of this injustice. And here's the thing, I have my moments where I'll get all passionate and I'll kill the slave driver, But when God has a bigger story and a challenge, I say no, and I have all these excuses, and I'm like, send anyone else. And there's so many reasons. It's much easier to have one passionate moment than to have an ongoing pattern of giving my time, of giving my money. I feel completely unequipped when it comes to discipling younger girls. Like, oh, who am I to come into some girl's life and be like, let me walk with you in something that I am so overwhelmed by? Or, like, honestly, I'm exhausted at the end of the day. Getting text messages or phone calls of somebody who is completely overwhelmed in a life decision, that's not what I have time for. I don't have energy to give to it. I don't have wisdom to give to it. And God's like, here's the thing though, I made you for this. I have stitched your life. For Moses, he's like, I raised you in Pharaoh's household. Who else am I going to send to Pharaoh to get my people and let them go? And after that, he stitched Moses in a way that was to stay. Here's what's a cool story. Moses' wife, literally in Exodus 2, starting in verse 17, you can go from there. But you can go back and see that when Moses fled Egypt after he had killed the guy over slavery, there were women kind of being picked on at a well, and he stood up for them, and that's actually how he ended up finding his wife. Guys, take note, stick up for girls, and you never know, one could be your wife. But they literally, this way that Moses was stitched was in a way where God's like, I made you in a way where you have to do something in injustice, where there are people being oppressed, where there are being people that are being shoved down, and you're like, no, this isn't okay. He made Moses in a way that was to be that person that would step up and be something about it. And we get really passionate in a moment, but God has such a bigger thing to invite us into that will actually be redemption and actually be justice. And we are nuts. I am nuts because I look back at him and I'm like, I was really passionate about that. But can you send somebody else in the whole plan you got going on? And it's fear and selfishness and a small mind and a small perspective. But isn't that nuts? This is why I had to share it, because I was so. I mean, I literally, I'm like speechless when I realized the very thing that God called Moses into is something that Moses had already seen the injustice and been like, who is going to do something about this injustice? Moses had already had that pull in his soul. And then God comes back around and he's like, actually, I designed and I'm inviting you to be the one that does something about this injustice. Like, how cool is that? And how relevant to me, as I am so quick to a passionate response and so quick to say something big about a social justice issue. But then when it actually comes to getting in the field and working hard every day, it's like, ooh, can it be someone else? Can it? So, how was this, y'all? What a story full of loaded stuff for us to learn from.